I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. At least 158 individuals killed, 6,000 injured, and more than 300,000 civilians lost their homes. This is the devastation that followed tragic explosions in the Lebanese capital of Beirut earlier last week. But to really understand why this explosion is so damaging, it's important to put this in context of how Lebanon has been reeling from ongoing social and economic challenges. To understand what's happening in the Middle Eastern country, joining us today to talk about Ms. Vida Hamd, who's a policy advisor overseeing humanitarian development and human rights programs in Lebanon. She joins us from Beirut. Also joining us from Beirut today is Mr. Gilbert Doumit, who's a political activist and policy expert. He also joins us from Beirut. Thank you both for joining us. And given the circumstances, I understand how taking out time would be so difficult, but we do extremely appreciate it. Ms. Vida Hamd, I'd like to begin with you now. There's a lot to talk about what's happening on ground, especially when it comes to the rescue operations. How many individuals are still missing? What update do we have so far?
Yes, indeed. On the ground, what we see is that the first responders rushed in to deal with the massive damages that happened. They were primarily volunteers, non-government organizations, community-based organizations who just rushed spontaneously to the site to provide basic assistance from water to food, shelter. And then they started also coming together in small to medium groups in order to clean up the debris. And many skilled individuals, including, for example, carpenters, engineers, they're coming together to try to help in the reconstruction and to do whatever can be done at this stage. The number of missings, the last of what I heard was 80 persons were missing. I can't provide you an update on that, but what I can say is that what we see on the ground is big agility. People mobilized very quickly with whatever resources were made available to them. They did not wait for the results of any political or legal investigation. They have made their position very clear. They do not want international aid to be politicized. They do not want politicians to be involved in any reconstruction or aid initiatives. They want to do it themselves through their own community-based capacities.
Now, Ms. Vida Hamd, as you point out, that's something we're also seeing echo across social media, how many Lebanese people are reiterating that they don't want the politicization of aid, they don't want political leaders to be involved in this process. But how difficult is it during this crisis for not having that support or not having that political leadership, especially when it requires coordination and cooperation with many other international players, many other international organizations?
Yes, indeed, that's a very, very important thing to take into consideration. Indeed, whereas the organization had coordinated together for this kind of response and that they have set out calls for assistance and fundraising, it's important to notice that when you are working on the ground, and even though they were very, very well, they are competent and they managed to communicate with the people even better than the government. And we all know that in times of crisis, the most difficult thing is the communication. At the same time, when you are working on the ground, what they need to, and what we all need to take into consideration is to keep strategic focus, to see whether we are able to scale up, because it's not enough to have small initiatives. At a certain point, you need to scale up because the level of the damage is huge. The organizations do not have the potential or the possibility to scale up by themselves, but when they come together, and they have come together in coalitions, and also they have worked along with the bigger organizations such as the UN to be able to rise up to the scale that is needed for reconstruction and for aid. At the same time, if we compare to the government, the state is also not capable and of responding. I think the state is what it has shown in the few first hours after the blast is that they are still trying to use old tools, old mechanisms to resolve a crisis that is unprecedented, I would say. We have not seen enough transparent and clear communication by the state to the people who are affected, whereas we have seen that from NGOs. We have not seen any capacity to build on or to use whatever has been made available for the Lebanese state from previous crises, from at least the past 10 years of international aid. They have not been able to put that into optimal use, even though I must say that at a later stage, there is a possibility that the state can get its act together and start using whatever mechanisms have been available to deal with past crises in order to scale it up and use it in the current crisis.
Right. Ms. Hamd, stay with me. We're going to come back to this point about whether this seems like the way to go in the future. As you're saying, there is a possibility for the state to come back together, regroup, and then act as it should in this crisis. But I'm going to move to Mr. Gilbert Doumit and talk to him a little more about what's happening on ground, especially related to the political unrest and the protests that have taken place. Now, the protests, we've seen the footages coming out. There has been a lot of violence against the protesters, especially during this time, this sensitive time. Seeing that happen, has the political leadership completely lost control of what's happening?
First, there is a crime that happened now in Beirut. So, as Vida was saying, 220 people killed so far, thousands of people without a shelter. In this moment, we're all expecting the resignation of the current government, who has been partly responsible of negligence, corruption, clientelism that led into the explosion. But also there are the political sponsors, the political leaders who have been there for long, for 30 years, who have been as well equally responsible that the protesters now, people on the streets, have a very clear demand. The current government and the political elite that sponsors it should be totally held accountable to the massacre that happened in Beirut a few days ago. And what is worse is that even the response, the state government has been totally absent from the field. So people are still collecting their own garbage, their own rubble. No one is taking care of people.
Mr. Gilbert Doumit, sorry to interject here, but you have mentioned this, and Ms. Hamd mentioned this as well, that the government, the state, seems to be completely absent from the scene. From observers outside, it seems very, very unusual, like that a crisis of this magnitude would take place and the government is not front and center. Where is it? What planning is happening? What do you hear about that?
So our state has been dismantled, has been destroyed prior to this massacre. So if we go back a week before, our financial system has totally collapsed, our economy is totally destroyed, our political system is totally in a deadlock. Already, before the massacre, before the crime, our state is in total chaos. So the massacre comes and escalates the problems that people are suffering from. In addition to this, because of the political polarization between the political factions that are in the country, makes government even more paralyzed, in addition to its incompetence, its incapacity, lack of financial resources to be exercising the role that's expected from it. So the situation is the result of a longer-term deterioration of the state. And this is why people are not asking only this government to resign. They're asking accountability from every political leadership for the last decade at least.
Every political leadership needs to be accountable for at least the past decade. Now, one of the things that we hope to do in this show is to contextualize what is happening today and put it into the broader context. How much of the civil war do you think still has its legacies that are leading up to what's happening today? How much of the ghosts of the civil war still haunt the conditions of Lebanon today? Because that's an analysis that we continuously see happening and being given.
Definitely at the level of people, the civil war is we're almost over it. But what remains from the civil war are the warlords. So the politicians who have done the war, who were responsible of the war, stayed in power after the Pact of 1990. And they stayed until today. They're the effective one who are in control of the political system, of corruption, of the weakening security and infrastructure. They're the same ones. So yes, in a way, we're still led by the same warlords who were there 30 years ago. And this is why for the last couple decades, those people have been dealing with government with the same mindset as warlords. So they only think about how they're going to have higher power control, how they're going to control over the government resources, how they're going to mobilize people based on their sectarian identities. And we've been suffering from those same political elite since then. This government is sponsored by one part of them. So we have one faction, three political parties who are in coalition who form this government, and we have the opposition. Both of them have been responsible for the situation. This government is only 6 months old, but effectively, the way the country is managed for the last couple decades is what led us to this moment of total destruction of the Lebanese state.
Right. I hear you there, and really does put a lot of things into place. It makes a lot of sense as to why it's so complicated to deal with the current political situation, because this government is only 6 months old, as you say, and there's such a long legacy that leads up to it. Ms. Vida Hamd, now, when we talk about what's been happening in the past decade and what happened leading up to October 17th, the Revolution Day, when we talk about this and when we talk about what happened afterwards, how do you see the human rights conditions varying? Do you see them changing? Do you think that they improved after the Revolution Day, or do you think that they just got worse?
Yes, first let me say that, let it be very clear that indeed what led us to this failure now at this point is a governance deficit created by a system that is paralyzed by confessional and clientelistic power-sharing mechanisms, and a constitution that came after the Civil War that is unable to deal with any kind of legal, constitutional, or any kind of crisis on the ground. Having said that, bear in mind, and also it's very clear that Lebanon has a history of human rights activism, that human rights situation and activists were already very vocal. We have a very vibrant civil society. However, it is not enough this is not enough, because it's not civil society and NGOs and human rights watchdogs that create political change. What is needed is more political activism. So indeed, we see a revolution that's been going on at least since October 2019. But the work of the NGOs on the ground and human rights activists is not in and of itself, enough to create a change in the political regime. It creates pressure, it creates the necessary visibility, it creates traction internationally to put Lebanon again on the international debate and discussions. But in order to create a political change, it is important that this activism and this group organize under certain political agendas and certain political action points. And this is what we have seen some of them try to create the emergence of new political parties, new political movement, but within the current context of the regime and power sharing agreements. If you do not organize under political groups and try to make it through parliament and then through cabinet, it is unlikely that only human rights activism will create in and of itself any change in the political regime.
Do you think that's what happened, that there was a lack of political will or lack of political change that was seen after October, which has led to the situation becoming what it is right now? Because when I read the reports of what's happening on the ground, blackouts that last for 22 hours a day, almost 1,600 private school institutions on the brink of closing because there's a financial crash, food security being threatened. So much is happening, basic human rights under threat. Do you think what happened in October wasn't enough to bring about the change that the people hoped for?
What I think is that the institution the institution is old. It is outdated. It is not listening to what the people are saying. It has no capacity to respond in the scale and as well as the time frame that is needed to prevent or even to respond to a crisis or to protect its citizen. The change in Lebanon, the way that change happens, if I look a little bit at how change happens in Lebanon within the political institutions, it is usually based on consensus that is built on confessions. It is not built on the typical understanding of the rule of law, which is the supremacy of human rights and legislation. So what gets passed in Lebanon and what changes in Lebanon is what the confessional leaders in Lebanon agree is good for all the confessions. It is not what best serves human rights or what best serves international standards and what best creates institutions that are agile and capable of responding to change.
Right. Mr. Doumit, when we about this and we talk about that there hasn't been enough change, now given the situation, given how Lebanon has unfortunately been thrusted into the limelight because of this unfortunate incident, we are seeing pressure mount for reforms, especially when it's linked to aid. I know Ms. Hamd said earlier on that the people on ground say do not politicize the aid, but that's what we're seeing happening. Do you think that that pressure will work?
While we speak now, and while we're expecting that government is going to resign, the political elite is still having the same practices. Means now aid that's coming from abroad, there is polarization between the political factions. Who's going to get those aid, so they distribute them to their own clientelistic networks, not genuinely for people who are the most in most need. But also they're trying to steal them. And we've heard, last week we've heard of several cases of aid coming and the political elite trying to steer them into their own networks, but also stealing them. So to say that nothing has changed in spite of the massacre and in spite of the pain that people are going through, and now government resigning, we're still seeing exactly the same practices. While we speak now, they're arresting activists who are asking for their own rights. People are being shot at with bullets, with live bullets. So nothing has changed until this moment, and this is why there is a mounting pressure internally. Citizens cannot take it anymore. I think we're reaching the limit where people are ready for violence to get rid of the current political elite. But also the international community is conscious of this. And this is why we've seen yesterday international meeting for Lebanon, the international community saying if any aid will come to Lebanon, it will not come through the current government. It will go through other channels so that people, citizens benefit from those aid the most. Because everyone is aware that the common practice is stealing this aid and diverting it to their own clientelistic networks.
Right. Now, Mr. There's two things I want to pick apart from what you've told us. One of them is, of course, how aid should be given directly to the people, so no political actors are involved. But one thing that you mentioned earlier was what has happened during these protests, what's happening with activists, them being shot with rubber bullets, with pellets, as we're seeing the reports unfold. This excessive use of force, what kind of political momentum has that created amongst the people? How are they mobilizing given this crisis and then given this political upheaval?
Reporting it is one of the most common sentences we hear. We have nothing to lose anymore. So the country is in a total collapse, politically, economically, financially. And now with the explosion on August 4th, even the city is totally destroyed, infrastructure, no access to education, health, water, electricity. People have nothing to lose. The use of violence by the system, by government, is only an indicator of their weakness. And they know that they have no other alternative but to resign and be accountable. And people cannot take it more. So there's full readiness for citizens to stay on the streets until the objectives are achieved and they're all held accountable. There's nothing to lose anymore in Beirut.
There's nothing to lose anymore. And those are very powerful words you state there. And I think they really encapsulate what's happening on the streets, what the images of Beirut are coming out like. Ms. Vida Hamd, now the point of aid being given and it not being given to the political parties or the government involved, but directly to the people. First of all, what do you think are the main sectors to which this aid will go to? Firstly, which are the weakest, which need the most aid? And secondly, how can this be ensured that it reaches the people and those who need it the most?
Yes, indeed. I think in light of the political situation and the civil unrest that we are seeing in Beirut, the the sectors that are going to be supported, I think, primarily would be the health sector that has taken a big blow because in addition to a sector that is already burdened by containing the coronavirus and by dwindling resources due to the economic and financial crisis in Lebanon, health is going to be a priority sector. There's been several hospitals also that were completely damaged in the areas. So health sector is one. I think food security is another, food and shelter is another sector, also given the crisis, the economic crisis, whereby already 50% of, if not more, of the Lebanese people were already being pushed below poverty lines before the blast happened. So food, shelter, health, let's not forget also education crisis. I think so far I've heard more than 35 schools have also been destroyed. Already the education sector has been dealing with the confinement and switching to online learning with all the difficulties and the lack of infrastructure that allows for that. So I expect also education to be a sector that is in need of help. And not to forget also what we call the social safety networks, whereby more and more people are going to be pushed below poverty lines, and there needs to be a social safety network and cash assistance given to the victims as well as to the people in poverty. Now, how this aid is going to be given, indeed, this is something that we are struggling with as aid workers. The international community has made it very clear that aid is not going to go directly to the Lebanese government. I think in light of this and in light also of the political unrest and the likely resignation of the government that we have now, we are likely to continue to see community-based aid provision, which is going to continue to be channeled through non-government organizations, the UN, community-based organizations, etc. I also want to say that we are also likely to see a role of the Lebanese diaspora that was also very quick in responding after the blast by sending cash contributions either to individuals or through NGOs, but not also in aid, also in maintaining the political pressure on international donors to prevent the politicization of reconstruction.
Right. Now, Ms. Vida Hamd, there's so much more to ask, but since I'm running short on time and I have to go for a break, I just want to put one last question to you, and I'm just going to get last comments from Mr. Doumit about it as well. You mentioned that state might be able to jump back from the position it's being in. It might be able to scale up efforts. You showed a note of optimism when you said that. What did you exactly mean by that? How is that going to happen after all that we've heard and discussed today?
First, and so that my message is clear and there is no miscommunication, first thing that I want to stress is that in the past 10 years, we have been talking about rebuilding state capacity, and we've been talking about maintaining the resilience of state institutions. I think after this blast, if anything changed, it should be our rhetoric on this. We are not talking anymore about rebuilding or reforming institutions. We need to talk about the dismantling of existing institutions and building up new institutions that are agile, competent, capable of dealing with repetitive crisis that the country has had. Having said that, we can build on existing mechanisms that we built in the past 10 years, having dealt with the Syrian refugee crisis. I give you an example. There is already a transfer system that have been used for some time now to provide cash assistance and food vouchers for vulnerable communities in Lebanon. These are already being incorporated in government systems. So it is time to scale these up to the extent that can respond to the blast. I'm talking about these kind of mechanisms that can be scaled up, but let it be very clear that the state institutions need a full, you need to dismantle all these institutions that are built on confessionalism.
And it needs to be built from the ground up. It be built from the ground up. I take your point there. And Mr. Doumit, just one last question to you. Are you optimistic that that will happen, given that we've seen political unrest for decades now, since we've also seen protests, we've also seen movements? Are you optimistic that after this, that stage will come when we see a complete revamp, a complete restructuring of the state?
Honestly, I think the blood is still on the streets. It's very difficult to be optimistic at this point in time, knowing that the whole state institutions and systems are collapsing. Maybe if there is one thing I would like to leave you and your audience with, to pressure governments, the Pakistani government, all governments in the world, to stop giving any legitimacy to the current government we have, but also to the political oligarchy that governs this country. This would be our best hope so that we can hold them accountable and build a state with accountability and justice, and without them ruling us again and again the way they did for the last 30 years.
Right, I take your point there, and thank you so much, Mr. Gilbert Doumit, for joining us from Beirut, Ms. Vida Hamd for joining us from Beirut. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our conversation. Stay with us. Welcome back as we continue to talk about what the way forward is in Lebanon. Now joining us for this conversation is Mr. Ahmed Jamal Ahmed, who's a Middle East expert. He joins us from Accra. Also joining us today is Ms. Vicky Pryce, who's a board member for the Center for Economics and Business Research and the former UK government advisor. She joins us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Vicky Pryce, now as we talk about the state of Lebanon, of course, we're seeing a crumbling economy. We're seeing their currency plummet. Now, what aid donors keep reiterating is that there's need for economic reforms. The IMF has also stated that it will redouble its efforts, but only if there are enough reforms. What type of reforms are needed for Lebanon at this point?
I think Mother Lebanon needs a complete restructuring of its economy. The IMF has been involved for quite some time trying to negotiate a possible 10 billion aid package. Well, of course, that isn't going to be sufficient now, given the destruction that we've just seen. But also, if you're looking at achieving some sort of sustainable growth for the future, the whole economy and the foundations of the Lebanon will need to change. Because the interesting thing is that for a long time, the country was receiving quite a lot of revenues as remittances from people who worked, from Lebanese workers who work in the Gulf. Of course, that had gone down quite significantly because of the oil price coming down. They also had quite a lot of tourism. That tourism, of course, has suffered because of the fights that have been taking place in the region more generally, and the general political uncertainty that has been around the Middle East. They've also had a pressure from Syrian refugees. Very substantial number of Syrian refugees had been coming and in some ways also taking jobs, people are saying, in the informal economy from Lebanese workers. Unemployment had risen very significantly, and the real fundamental problem had also been that the currency was pegged to the dollar, with the result that at that level, the Lebanese economy was very uncompetitive. It encouraged a lot of imports from elsewhere, with the result that, of course, there was very little productive investment that was going into the economy. Since that peg was lifted of sorts back at the end of 2019 or in the autumn of 2019, we've seen the informal rate plummet very significantly. So instead of 1,500 to the dollar, it was more like 7,500 to the dollar. So there were parallel currencies, basically, or parallel rates being used. And also, of course, we've had the serious problems of people having been encouraged to leave foreign currency deposits with the banks at high interest rates. And those, of course, were unsustainable. And the moment any crisis hit, people have not been able to get their money back from the banks. So it's not an easy situation. It is one that requires complete rethink of what the economy might need to do in the future to get back into some sort of productive growth, rather than what it was depending on in the past, who simply cannot keep the economy and all the people who need the jobs going for any length of time. In addition, of course, we have a lot of concern about corruption, which people claim is there, and wealth is distributed very, very unevenly. And that needs to also be looked at. So I'm afraid, if the IMF is going to be involved and is going to be putting conditions, those conditions are likely to be pretty tough.
Those conditions are likely to be pretty tough. Now, Ms. Vicky Pryce, what you give us is a very holistic overview of what was happening even before this explosion. Now, after this explosion, which estimates show has caused almost $15 billion of loss to the economy, after this, how is it possible for economy to even go back to how it was before, or how to even move in the right direction? It seems like a very impossible situation.
what happened in 2019. It got even worse. We had negative growth of something like 7%. The IMF has been estimating in this latest forecast back in April 2020 that this year we would see a fall of possibly 12%, if not more, in the economy. With that type of economic environment, you can't actually have employment meeting the needs of the population, a young population, well-educated. And what was happening, of course, was that with the unpegging of the currency to the dollar, we've seen very serious shortages also emerging in the economy. We've seen inflation actually rising very significantly. The value of the currency has been reduced very significantly, with the result that I think at some point in the last month or two before this explosion, we were talking about an inflation rate of something like 50 to 60%, which is extraordinary. It meant that loads and loads of Lebanese people found themselves on the poverty line, which itself was causing a huge amount of unrest. And you also had an economy that wasn't properly managed. You had, electricity supply being in disarray. You had cuts in electricity supply for people in Beirut for many hours every day. So we were really talking about an economy that needed restructuring long before this latest crisis hit. You add to this COVID and also, of course, the explosion. You add to this what was going on in the Gulf in terms of remittances being reduced from workers there. You add, as I said before, the whole issue of refugees coming in. It's an economy that needs complete rethink. And you ask, is it easy and can you do that? Well, I'm afraid it needs political will. And that political will needs somehow to be established. And that's where politics comes back in again, I'm afraid.
Right, Ms. Vicky Pryce, stay with me on that point. Very important point. You talk about the intersection of politics with the economy at this point, and neither can happen without the other. And I want to come back to that point, but before that, I want to jump to Mr. Ahmed, Jamal Ahmed, and talk to him a little about the regional aspect of what's happening in Lebanon. Now, when we talk about peace, when we talk about any chance of peace, is it possible, given the turbulent situation all across the region and where Lebanon is situated?
Regarding peace, who are we talking about? Who are the actors here? I mean, if you talk about the citizens, yes, they want peace. They have been peaceful for the majority since the state was created. But you're talking about warlords who have taken over the government, who've been elected by their bases, and essentially are running the government since what they call the Civil War in the 1970s. So when it comes to the population are tired. They want peace, they want prosperity, they want an opportunity to have some personal economic opportunities, and they want to express themselves. Unfortunately, you have the political parties who cannot, and I'll repeat this again, cannot be held accountable because the mechanisms for holding them to account, for making sure they're responsible for their actions and behavior are not there.
Right. Ms. Vicky Pryce, now one thing that I said that we're going to come back to is, of course, how the politics of all of this comes into trying to stabilize the economy. Now, in the previous segment, we talked about how the people completely distrust the political leadership. Foreign donors completely distrust the political leadership. That's why they want to give aid directly to the people and not have the government involved in this. Now, when we talk about reforms and how the IMF is involved, how does that happen when the government has lost its legitimacy?
What has happened in other countries, and I think it's useful to think about the Eurozone crisis. Just think about Italy, just think about Greece. I'm not suggesting that the problems are the same. They're nothing like as bad, perhaps, as in the Lebanon, where very, very large debt-to-GDP ratios, though in both cases. And of course, the Lebanon also has a very, very high debt-to-GDP ratio, about 150%. But what happened for a period is that the IMF and the Europeans, who were about to give extra financial support to Greece and Italy, more or less insisted on a technocratic government coming into place. So we've had economic professors appointed to be prime ministers. We had some of the previous ministers still remaining there, but the whole sort of machinery of government sort of still stayed, but you had superimposed a lot of technocratic support from the donor organizations who were there watching and seeing what was actually happening. That is a possibility. Of course, we mustn't forget that the reason why Lebanon is run the way it is to accommodate the various different religions that exist, and there's been a long established principle that, of course, sometimes gives way to paralysis in government and quite a lot of misallocation, possibly, of resources that way. But you can perhaps think of how a technocratic government or technocratic machinery can perhaps take over and do what the aid organizations may be requiring Lebanon to do, which the people perhaps will trust a bit more.
Right. I take your point there, and that's an important one to make. Mr. Ahmed, Jamal Ahmed, we talk about how the Syrian war and its fallout has impacted Lebanon, and we talk about how the Syrian refugees have entered Lebanon. 1.5 million are hosted there. When we talk about long-lasting peace, is that possible if the situation in Syria remains as it is, if there is constant turbulence from Israel? What do you see happening because of the regional outpour that comes and impacts Lebanon?
Well, going back to the regional dynamics, yes, they do affect the internal domestic scenario in Lebanon. But again, we have to understand why it affects, because it is allowed to affect. You've got parties, political parties, in Lebanon who are beholden to external interests. You have Hezbollah beholden to the Iranian interest. You have Ahmed, the same thing. And they are also allies with Syrian Bashar al-Assad. So that axis right there is in direct conflict with the interests of the Lebanese state, the sovereignty of the Lebanese state. So this issue of neutrality has got to be reassessed, because we cannot have neutrality in the face of such unprecedented pressure on the Lebanese state. And previously, before we got cut off, I was explaining that the reason why the power structure in Lebanon still is sustained and exists is because there are no enforceable mechanisms to hold them to account.
Yeah, right. It seems, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but it seems like that's one point that keeps on coming up when we talk about what the future of Lebanon is that there needs to be accountability, there needs to be transparency, and there needs to be a complete restructuring of how the political system works there. Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed, Jamal Ahmed, for joining us from Accra, and Ms. Vicky Pryce for joining us from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.